I'm Caroline Bugge.
I'm Ben Goodson.
I'm Bugge.
And I'm Suleiman Tahir. Welcome, Sinar Mas. We are extremely excited to be working with you. So Sinar Mas is one of the biggest clients and one of the biggest refineries in Indonesia. We are extremely excited working with you, especially because of how innovative of a company you are. At Team Huan, we have noticed that you are so innovative, but there's still some areas where you lack in labor conditions and sustainability. So that's why we are here today.
Yeah, and a little bit of us, we're Huan Consulting, a new consulting firm dedicated to the recommendation of sustainable labor and fair labor practices. And we bring about the best future of our clients while improving the conduct of labor.
We decided to take a focus on honest labor because it's ultimately what's going to make your business sustainable in the long run. Also, focusing on labor gives us tangible, short-term ideas that we can measure and point to in just a year's time.
Let's think about why fair labor practices equates to long-term sustainability. With ESG an ever more important metric for investors looking to the future, it is pertinent that Sinar Mas take decisive action to meet fair labor practices and expand their market share both domestically and abroad, given its importance to people of all ages and the global trend towards the cause.
So Juan's recommendation, Sinar Mas. So our biggest recommendation is to implement something very simple as vertical integration. With vertical integration through ownership and partnership, you can reap many benefits, and we will explain how going forward.
So let's talk about vertical integration. It is, as Sinar Mas, one of the 5 biggest refiners. You guys currently have 2 steps in your supply chain right now. First, you have to purchase from the farmers the oil that then gets transported to your refineries. Well, vertical integration, we're going to cut out some of those costs and take ownership of land, and that will give Sinar Mas better profits, better revenues by cutting those costs. And partnerships will just kind of safeguard that transition. So ownership is also important because it gives Sinar Mas the ability to have authority over the labor practices that are happening on the farms that they own.
As well as ownership, we at Huan Consulting recommend to Sinar Mas that you guys take risks to mitigate your risks when going in the palm oil business.
We talk about risk mitigation because if we move to owning the land that the farmland that we're getting our oil from, and say some sort of tragedy strikes that farmland, we are then operating at a little bit of a dangerous territory, and none of our oil is being pulled from those fair labor farmlands. We'd be just at a default where we have to continue working with the farms we are pulling from that aren't necessarily sticking to the fair labor regulations.
So as well as ownership, we offer a exclusive partnership with smallholder farms. So the one stipulation that we have for them is that they must become partially or fully RSPO, CSPO certified, which those RSPO, CSPO certifications let us know that they're practicing sustainable agriculture as well as fair labor practices. As well as that, we can also buy up RSPO smallholder credits, which basically means we don't necessarily get that sustainable palm oil, the ton of sustainable palm oil, but we can subsidize these farm holders with premiums so that we can entice them to grow sustainable palm oil and sell that to other companies globally. So what's in it for the partnering farmers? Higher yields. Many studies have been conducted on the effects of RSPO agricultural techniques, and they can yield to higher yields, which then leads to higher profits for these farms. And that leads to better standards of living, higher wages, no child labor, and better working conditions because these farms must be partially or fully RSPO certified. What's in it for Sinar Mas? Again, higher profits, higher yields coming from those sustainable agriculture techniques, as well as market access. Today, more than ever, the typical consumer cares about where their products are coming from. Are they sustainably farmed? Or is there fair labor? Are they ethically done? And finally, what's in it for everyone? Sustainable and ethical farming of palm oil, which then, as we all know, can decrease climate change and help labor standards around the world.
And here's a visual of how we're going to use our partnerships to just make sure that the proper labor regulations are being enforced in a way that we couldn't if we were just buying the oil straight from the farmers without the partnership. Oops. Okay, so we're going to quantify our goals into a couple of different, three different time periods. So because we recognize that it's easier to take in a partnership right off the bat as opposed to ownership, being that there are costs associated with buying farmland in that form of vertical integration, we want 20% of our oil going through Sinar Mas's refinery to be from farms that are adhering to proper labor regulations by the year end of 2021. 6%, a small percentage, is direct ownership. And then 18% we recommend be from partnership. And then by 2020, we're going to increase that to 30%, and we're going to narrow that margin a little bit so that it's only 2/3, 1/3 in terms of ownership and partnership, and then continuing to narrow that gap into 2023. And by having 36% of our oil coming from proper labor farmland, we're making great strides in terms of fair labor practices.
So in fair labor practices, to really quantify the results, while the Indonesian government does not have any specific labor statistics or scores that we can go by, instead we would use a globally representative variety social assessment, which lists in action plans every time a company goes through the assessment. So to quantify Sinar Mas's performance, they have to complete 60% of listed action plans before the next assessment, which happens every 2 years. And also for transparency reason for labor, they can go through annual external audits to really show their motivation in achieving goals in labor conditions.
With our vertical integration approach, we expect cost of goods sold to decrease every forecast year, as illustrated by the graphic to the left. Moreover, even with a stagnant revenue growth for the forecast years, the operating margins continue to increase year over year, even without the electrification plan, which now Suleiman will discuss as a means of creating a whole new business segment for Sinar Mas.
So what's the Huan difference? We are very creative. So methane is an already produced resource by palm oil waste as a byproduct, which is wasted every single year. Instead of wasting this, how about we put it in another segment and produce electricity from that, with the main cost being the anaerobic digestion chamber. And by using this, not only will it drive down costs for productions for Sinar Mas, it will also can be used to sell as a product as a source of income, and also can benefit community, going a long way in the corporate social responsibility for Sinar Mas.
Now let's look at the financials in a different lens with the electrification process included. So as you can see with this before and after, as Suleiman mentioned, either keeping that energy internal and using that as a way of running the refinery itself, or turning around and selling the electricity as an export and receiving profits from the sale of the electricity into the community. We're either going to see through profits of sale or decreased cost of keeping the electricity internal, a net profit increase of 20%. This is wonderful for Sinar Mas, especially looking at their long-term sustainability. And that's something that we predict the adoption of using this electrification technology into hopefully the next 2 years in terms of starting that up and getting that running. So that is our Huan Difference. And we're so excited to have a company like you that is so forward with innovation. And we're welcome to any questions you have for us now.
Thank you. We'll start with our 5-minute Q&A session now.
Thank you very much for a very insightful presentation. I was very intrigued with this notion of being able to, utilize methane. Can you talk a little bit more about, if you're going to be able to capture methane, maybe additional costs, what technologies would be used to capture the methane, and have you factored that into your analysis?
Yes, great question. We have. Ben, if you would mind going to the slide after the references, we kind of figured this might be something that could use a little bit more information. And I know Suleiman can probably talk a little bit more in depth, but this is something that companies like Fairlife have taken advantage of because their cows release methane, and they've been able to use that. So Suleiman, you want to talk about some of the details?
Yep, so for sure. So essentially what this process is, so the biggest component of getting the methane is like basically every lagoon of palm oil equates to almost 22,000 passenger cars worth of pollution. So a lot of methane is being emitted from every lagoon. So to encapsulate that, what we can use is an anaerobic digestion. So anaerobic digestion essentially like captures the methane and then it digests it in biogas fuel. And then further down the chain, this gas can basically power through a generator, which produces electricity. So the main cost in this is the anaerobic digester, which is going to be cost at $1.2 million.
And if I may jump in to say one more point about this, is that methane gas is 34 more times more lethal to our environment than carbon dioxide, and the burning of methane gas will turn it into carbon dioxide. So unfortunately, we will not be able to remove whole greenhouse gases, but removing 34% or 34 times more gas from our environment is good for our corporate social responsibility.
And yeah, just jumping off of that and just putting it in perspective, like this palm oil plantations, like most of them where this comes from is like measures in the hectares, like hundreds of thousands of them. And each hectare has the potential to produce like at full capacity, 0.94 kilowatts, which in the end, like if you calculate that, ends up a lot of electricity being produced every year.
And then just one last statement on that. The goal in the business-oriented side of this is that by generating a whole new business segment through the electrification process of methane, we will not only be able to set a standard in the industry in a country that is responsible for a vast majority of palm oil production, but it would also force competitors to either adapt the practices and or merge with Sinar Mas eventually.
Which comes back to a question that I think was sent in the chat about why it's underutilized. So it does have costs associated with launching, but as Manya mentioned, as this starts to gain popularity, and Sinar Mas is the third largest refinery in Indonesia, they are well situated to take this into the competitive sphere, and that could really take off this technology and be beneficial environmentally across the board.
And just, speaking to why it hasn't been employed in the past, it's mostly due to the fact that a lot of the farms are off the grid, and that comes with its own struggles as well. And so with that said, however, being able to build the infrastructure out for this will not only provide for a reduction in costs for our own bottom line, but it will also allow us to increase revenues by selling electricity to not only urban areas, but also to rural areas and for future revenue.
With our last few minutes, are there any other questions?
Yes, I have a question going back to your first proposition, and I'd like to know a little bit more about your smallholder farmers and taking over ownership of the land. How will that affect women and men differently? And is the land actually titled?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't see us doing taking large strides in terms of treatment of men and women. We want to enforce the labor regulations that the Indonesian government has tried to propose, and I know that includes things like maternal leave, and there are implications with that. As taking ownership, we talked about it with our team, and we didn't want to. We wanted to respect those people, the locals who are employed. And so it's kind of more of an oversight training, coming in with certifications and making sure it's being followed, as opposed to total control, top down. We're going to find totally new people to employ. So it's not like we're getting new employees. So I don't know how that will. We're not planning on changing the ratio of men to women. We're just ensuring fair labor practices as suggested by the Indonesian government.
Awesome.
Hey, that's your time for questions. So we'll feed into that now.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. We're going to